Hello, I'm Marco Corbetta. I'm Senior Technical Director at Foundry 42 Frankfurt. We're going to talk about planets today. So, what we're going to look at here today is the planet tech and some of the features we're going to include into our first 3.0 release. The planet tech is exactly the same tech which we have been using for moons, planets, Delamar, the Delamar planetoid, Lasky, and so on. Each planet is unique, it has its own gravity, ecosystems, objects, weather, and atmosphere. If you look at the footage here, the progress we made since we started working on this, you can see the planet from space, and you can smoothly fly from planet to space without any cutscenes or interruptions. The major challenge here is that you can land anywhere seamlessly on the planet. And basically, the only way to do this is to generate the planet's surface as you're approaching it. The terrain is getting generated, recursively subdivided. Objects are procedurally scattered on the surface as they are becoming visible, as well as particles, ground details, and so on. When you are on the surface, you're able to see objects like space stations, moons, and so on, orbiting around the planet in space.
For our entering the atmosphere and getting closer to a planet, in order to make sure that it looks good on all levels, from high up to the ground, we have different artist-driven input on each level. So on a global scale, we have our color map that defines the colors of the planet. And then when you get closer, we have our ecosystems that is defining our features. These all fade into each other and become one thing. So the closer you get, the more it fades towards the final result on the ground.
We can also transition from a solar system down to a planet's surface. Here we're showing the scale we're dealing with. You can see the different level of zooming from a solar system down to the different moons and planets. It's very challenging to deal with generating all these different type of environments at all these different scales. We have a fixed pool of geometry shared for all planets and a fixed pool of memory used for texture streaming. Since you can land anywhere, as mentioned before, the only solution is to procedurally generate on demand the planet's surface. The geometry is generated on the fly, and textures are procedurally combined at runtime, blending many layers. This allows seamless transition from space to planet. The source data used for generation is very small. For example, on these moons, we are using only about 5 unique ecosystems for each planet. Each ecosystem has different properties, and they are all combined with other layers and noise combinations to generate a large amount of variations all over the planet's surface. Another interesting thing is that we are using only 1K resolution for all textures created by our environment artists. These textures are used for planets generation. So we have developed an efficient generation and blending to combine all these textures layers together and still getting good results when you're close to the surface.
The biggest challenge, I think, with what we've been working on lately is the scattering of all these objects on the terrain. From the last update that we made, we have done a lot of progress on the terrain and the textures. We could render all these big mountains and oceans and all this type of stuff. But in the end, the planets were still empty. There was no content, there were no objects, no rocks, no trees and all that. We had a very basic system, but that didn't really work for what we wanted to achieve. So most of the R&D time that we had in the last couple of months went into this object scattering system. The difficulty with the object scattering is to get a natural look. When you traditionally you make a level for a game, and you can place your rocks anywhere you like, or your trees, and you can compose the scene where the player comes in, and you have this nice vista and these background assets and all this type of stuff. But we can't really do this on the procedural level. We cannot really place all the assets by hand, so we need a way that kind of automates this for us. And of course, you want this to look as natural as possible. So you want to have a little bit of control, but also want to have most of the work you want it to be taken care of by an algorithm. We developed a system where you can kind of define what assets you have. Say you want to do a forest, you need some trees, you need some leaves, you probably want some grass on the ground, and then you can define certain object groups and say, okay, I want to have a tree in there. And then you can define a certain logic that around the tree you have leaves. You can define particle effects so that the leaves fall down. You also can add audio in there, so you have like wind blowing through the tree. Basically, these object groups or object presets are like packages which then are assigned onto the terrain on specific areas where you want these trees to grow, basically. And then the scattering is done in an automatic way, but it follows a certain logic. So you you can define like a natural harmony, so it's not just completely random or in a grid pattern that would be very noticeable to the human eye. You get to define how the assets are arranged. So you have like a huge rock, you want some smaller rocks around them, and then some very tiny rocks around those again. So you kind of create an aesthetic. So it's not just, okay, I have this big rock and the small rock and the tiny rock, and then it just scatters it over kilometers of terrain. We had this in the beginning, and then we added more and more parameters to change the visuals. And then, of course, you have values to tweak random scaling, random rotation, alignment to the terrain, and all this type of stuff.
As an art team, we produce all the content that forms our final planet, and that contains like the ecosystems that define our terrain shapes. It includes the materials that define the look of the ground when you are walking around in first person. We built the rocks and the assets and the shrubs and the plants. We basically build all these components, and it's remixed in our procedural planet tech. Besides reusing and remixing our textures and materials, we also built them in a smart way. When we build a material for our rocks, for example, we also use the same material in our ground textures to define how the small rocks on the ground look. In order to do this, we use Substance Designer, which really allows us to break down all our texturing components into separate modules, which we can then like plug in and remix and change the settings on the fly. So this really allows us to speed up our texture creation process and allows us to quickly knock out like different variations of different colors of sand, different amount of rocks on the ground. And we have a lot of ground to cover on our planet, so we try to cover a lot of space, multiple planets. So we need to make sure that however we work, we do it in a smart way. Whenever we try to define a material palette for one of our planets or locations, what we actually do is we build our set of materials and we apply them in an asset suite where we can toggle the time of day, have a view of like what does it look like at a steep sun angle, what does it look like at a 12 o'clock sun. And that way, when we combine all these elements, we know that at least at the baseline, everything looks good. When feeding these materials into our planets, there's various elements that influence how the final material looks on the planet. Procedurally, these different materials will be mixed, other elements will come in. It will sample colors from the global definition of how the colors look on the planet. So wherever you go on the planet, the result of the ground is never the same. What we try to do when we build an asset library for the procedural system is to not, for example, define the final surface material. So what we try to do is make sure that it's reusable as well. We can take the same rock type or same rock shape and then reapply a different material on there and then use it in a neighboring moon or system. This is making sure that we can put more in our memory because we're using the same base elements, but it also makes like covering this large area faster.
Another big challenge that we had with the object scattering, or how we build our frames in the game and make these environments look very good, was that we don't really have any background assets. So in traditional games, you always have your foreground and your midground, and then you also have background assets that are basically making up the scenery where you normally never go there. For example, you're in your jungle, and in the back there's like a big volcano, but you can never really go there. It looks really epic, but it's mostly just a background asset. In Star Citizen, there is no such thing as a background. Everything that you see on the screen, you can go to. And this also then goes into our workflow, how we make the assets. Sometimes the things in other games that you see in the background is just a painting. It always looks the same, and if you go up close, you just see there's a wall in front of your face, which never happens because the player space is restricted. But in Star Citizen, there is no restriction for the player space. For like smaller rocks, this is fine because you only see them when you come really close to them. But if you have large cliffs in the back, you want to see them from far away. Obviously you see them when you're close up, and you want to have them nice and detailed, and you want to have a nice transition when you come from outer space and these large objects are coming up. Every asset has to be made that it works first person, that it works from a little distance, that it works far out in the background, and it also should work from out of space.
Another major challenge is dealing with online games and procedural generation, because the generation needs to be deterministic on all machines. So we need to do a bunch of operations on CPU side to make sure it all works on the dedicated server as well. Usually dedicated servers don't have a graphics card. So currently all terrain generation is done on CPU, and most of the visual textures blending is done on GPU on the client. Generation results are cached in the fixed geometry pool mentioned before, and the generation is distributed over all available meshing cores. So the generation is very efficient and is scaling with the number of available cores. The generation results are exactly the same on client and server, so there is no need to transmit any information to replicate the environment. Here we're watching a video recorded by our QA of 4 players playing together and landing on a planet. You can see the seamless transition of all of them landing on the same planet surface.
What makes working with our Planet Tech so different is the scale. When you would work on an FPS level, for example, you would, even if it's a very large map, you would cover like 4 kilometers. You don't have to worry about what happens outside of the playable boundaries. What we try to do in Star Citizen is basically cover all those elements. So you come in from a very far distance, fly close to the surface, you step out of your ship and you walk around and look at like the rocks and the ground and the details. You have to make sure you cover all these different ranges, which takes some getting used to. It's an interesting system to work with for sure. And on the one hand, you lose the opportunity to handcraft every single meter around you. At the same time, you're generating like large-scale environments, and the procedural system allows us to set up these rules where the way the stuff that's placed, you get these situations where like, wow, I couldn't have like made this if I tried to.
You never really know what's going to happen, how the objects are arranged. So every now and then you come to a corner of the moon, which you have never seen before. I mean, on one hand, you don't have the hand placing control, but you also don't really want this because you spent years on just one planet. But yeah, the nice thing is that every now and then you come to a certain corner of the planet or the moon, and you're just surprised by how the objects are arranged. And it just works out beautifully. Also with the sunlight, you never know how the sunlight is because the planets, you never know what time it is, or you can't just say, okay, I want this in a sunset. So every now and then you have these moments where everything comes together and it just works out beautifully, and you have this nice, scenic, huge environment right in front of you.
We define the rules. We define our shapes that we would like to see, but it isn't until everything comes together and you actually fly around and just land and just look around like, wow, all these elements that our team built right now, it's all put together, and this is the world that we made.
To end this presentation, we're going to show you a procedural planet visual effects breakdown, showing how the different elements are combined to compose the final image. Thanks for watching.